Hello, everybody, and welcome to Heart of the Matter. I'm your host, Elizabeth Vargas. Thank you so much for being here with us this week. And we have on our show today a journalist and writer who's really done some groundbreaking work. His name is Sam Quinones. And several years ago, he wrote a book called Dreamland, which is one of the first books to really delve into the burgeoning opioid crisis at the time. The book went on to win so many awards. It was actually called one of the best nonfiction books written in the last 25 years. In this book, his new book called The Least of Us, he continues that work. In this case, he's delving into the fentanyl and meth crisis in America and delving into exactly how the Mexican cartels have now shifted the way they work and are now mass producing in these laboratories all over Mexico fentanyl in pills that are made to look just like Percocet or Valium, fentanyl in other drugs as well, such as cocaine and even on occasion in marijuana. Sam has said that this is the end of the recreational party drug. So many people who take drugs because they want to have fun are finding those drugs are laced with fentanyl. And we saw that tragically just a few days ago when we saw several members of the West Point Academy overdose on fentanyl in Florida during spring break. It is a frightening thing. This drug is extremely deadly. We know that opioid overdoses are at record highs, but 70% of those overdoses are because fentanyl was in those drugs. And Sam delves into the fact that, and in this podcast discusses the fact that many of today's kids are buying these drugs on social media. Sam has a lot of important things to say in his new book, The Least of Us, and we are very excited to welcome Sam Quinones to Heart of the Matter. Sam Quinones, welcome to Heart of the Matter. Good to have you here. We've been wanting to have you on for a long time. You were the first, actually, person to write a book about the burgeoning opioid crisis in that groundbreaking book, Dreamland, which won a ton of awards. It was followed by a series of other great books on the crisis. Many of those people have been on the podcast, Beth Macy, who wrote Dope Sick, and Patrick Radden Keefe, who wrote Empire of Pain. And you have followed up Dreamland with a new book out called The Least of Us. And in this book, you take on the explosion of synthetic drugs like fentanyl and a scary new form of methamphetamines. Tell me how this came about.
Well, the book really didn't grow from the drug side of it. It grew shortly after Dreamland came out. I began to think, and I thought during writing Dreamland that a big part of what had happened to us as a country was that we had demanded, magic bullet, silver bullet answers to what are very, very complicated problems. In the case of the opioid epidemic, we demanded a cure for pain, and medicine came up with one pill. So one pill for everybody. And that was supposed to cure our pain. And the truth is it created an enormous amount of collateral damage that we're still living with today. So as that book came out, I began to focus more on stories of people who were not involved in finding miraculous cures to all that ails us, rather wanted to find people who were involved in the smallest, simplest, most kind of consistent kind of daily work kind of ways of showing up to repair community in wherever it was that they lived. And that became my focus. Then along the way, as I spoke more and more as the demand as the awareness of the opioid epidemic grew, and the book became kind of like a guide to people of what had happened, I began to travel more and speak and all. And as I did, I began to see that what I had written about was actually in the process of changing rather dramatically. And in fact, within a few years, it was completely transformed. And that had to do with major change down in Mexico, basically, that the trafficking world down in Mexico had grown up on the land. They were the pioneers were ranchers and farmers, but now their children or grandchildren or whatever, we're now seeing that actually made a whole lot more sense. If you're going to deal drugs, to make them yourself rather than grow them. And so we began to evolve into the synthetic era of drugs with no plants involved that was kind of a natural outgrowth for a lot of these guys. They figured out this was a much better business proposition. You didn't need land, you didn't need farmers, rainfall, sunlight. All you needed was shipping ports, because shipping ports got you access to world chemical markets through which you could get all the chemicals you ever needed to make the drugs that you were now making. And the two drugs that they learned to make most immediately were, they already knew how to make methamphetamine, but then they learned how to make fentanyl. And those two combined today to create the problems that we're seeing now, really coast to coast, because they've covered the country with supplies of these drugs that really is only paralleled by the amount of pain pills were prescribed by doctors.
Let's start first with fentanyl, because it's scary. It is responsible for 70% of the drug overdoses in this country. And
Yes.
a few small specks of this fentanyl can kill you. It is, you have said, it is the deadliest drug we have ever known. And first of all, do people just go out and buy fentanyl, or is it they're getting fentanyl inside cocaine or heroin, or even I've heard of it popping up in marijuana? Is that true?
It's both. Some dealers buy it in some form of bulk, and then mix it into cocaine and so on. The trafficking world now down in Mexico has taken to including putting fentanyl into counterfeit pills that look every bit like the pain pills that we used to get prescribed with.
Right, like Percocet or OxyContin. It looks just like a pain
all of
pill,
those, all of those pills now are coming with only fentanyl in them. And this is all because of the enormous capacity for production that synthetic drugs and access to the world chemical markets allows these trafficking groups down in Mexico. And so, yes, it's almost like it's so prevalent. It's like salt on food, you just sprinkle it on. Well, trafficking dealers at the street level frequently now are including it in their cocaine, and to sometimes very deadly effect. But people always ask me, well, why would you add a deadly drug to kill your customers paying you? Well, there's actually very good reasons from a dealer's perspective why you would do that. The main one is that if you are selling, let's say, cocaine buyers buy every few days, every week. Maybe they take a couple of weeks off. They don't buy all the time. And when you insert fentanyl into it and they survive, they become addicted very quickly. This happens rapidly within a few contacts to the fentanyl. And it's that point that they have to buy from you every single day. There's no taking a vacation from opioid addiction. You don't take 2 weeks off. It's every single day and several times a day, frequently with fentanyl. And so that's part of this story. And again, a lot of people don't have the tolerance for it and die. And that's why we have seen these new record overdose death rates over the last numerous months because fentanyl.
So are you saying that it's the fentanyl in the opioids that's killing all these people? That's why we're having all these records set in overdose rates?
It's a little bit of both. These are not opioids. These are counterfeit pills. These are pills that made to look like a Percocet, made to look like a Xanax bar or an OxyContin generic 30 milligrams. The only thing that they have in them is fentanyl, and they're made down in Mexico. They're pressing these things by the tens of millions, I think, right now, really dramatically upping the production of those things. And it's essentially what it boils down to, either intentionally or not. It is really supply creating demand. In the case of, say, fentanyl mixed into cocaine, the people using cocaine do not want to be addicted to fentanyl, but they become so very quickly, and then they can't escape it.
They don't know. They don't know that the cocaine they're buying has fentanyl in it.
Not initially. After a while, everybody knows, though. I think in many parts of the country, after you've survived your initial contact with fentanyl, at first, say, it was mixed into heroin. Now there's no more heroin on the street. I mean, we're very close in this country to being a country that is heroin free. The fentanyl has just simply crowded it out. Heroin is worthless, in fact. Now, if you are addicted to fentanyl and you have a very high tolerance, heroin just will not keep the dope sickness away. And so over and over, you see all these regions of the country where they're just reporting no real heroin. They may call it heroin, but all it really is, everybody knows what's in it. It's fentanyl. And this is, again, how it's being spread. All these folks now who survive are now addicted to fentanyl. Fentanyl, by the way, is a magnificent drug. Medically, surgically, I've had fentanyl myself. Many of your listeners will have had fentanyl. It's a magnificent, it revolutionized surgery. Used in surgery is fantastic.
As an anesthetic?
It's an anesthetic. It's an opioid. It's an opioid. It hits every bit of the same brain chemistry as morphine and heroin, just much more potent. The other thing about it is, though, that it gets you into anesthesia and out of it very quickly. That's what made it enormously useful in the surgical setting. You could send somebody into anesthesia, do a quick operation, get them right back out, and that person is lucid and coherent, walking right out of the hospital. With fentanyl, because of that quick in, quick out, that makes it such a great surgical drug, it's a curse to users, right? Because you now have to be using every 4-6 hours. You begin to feel the onset of withdrawals very, very quickly. Of course, if you're a dealer, why, it's magnificent. It's dirt cheap, easy to smuggle, and you get folks who have to buy it from you, repeatedly all the time. Again, there's no vacation from opioid addiction. You don't take 2 weeks off.
So drug dealers are putting fentanyl in other drugs, knowing it will hook their customers quickly.
Yes.
And that those customers will then need to come back every 4 to 6 hours for more of it because the dope sickness starts.
Or they'll have to buy more per day than they ever did with heroin. That's generally what happens. You buy, if you were using 2 grams a day now, I talked with a guy in Maine, think of that. Guy was using 2 grams of heroin a day, and then fentanyl comes along. He's strung out. He doesn't have any other choice, he says. So he switches to fentanyl, and then he's using 7 grams a day, which, it's just a whole other level of drug usage, which means, of course, that you are participating essentially in what amounts to a game of Russian roulette every time you use. Very much different than what was the case with heroin. Although that was dangerous, this is a whole other level of danger, because the mix it's, as you said, it's such a small amount of the drug that will make you hooked, and you are relying on the underworld to mix it properly. And there's no such thing as a consistent good mix by folks in the drug world. They just don't know how to do it, and a lot of times they don't care.
It is driving, when you say those drug overdose rates. We know that drug overdoses are up 29% just in the last year nationally. In 10 states in this country, drug overdose rates are up by more than 40%. Is
Right.
fentanyl driving all of that?
Yes, correct. That's it. That's the whole story right there. But there's something a little bit more to it than that. And that is that fentanyl started out in 2014-15 as in areas that had been hardest hit by the opioid epidemic: Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, places like that. And that was when most of the fentanyl was coming from Chinese chemical companies. Folks here were buying it on the web. They would have it sent to them via the mails. You're talking about a pound at a time. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it really hadn't spread that much, because you just can't send that many pounds to cover the entire country. But then in 2019, the Chinese government put regulations on it. Now only a few companies can make fentanyl. The companies in China, though, began to sell to the trafficking world in Mexico the ingredients for making fentanyl. So the folks in Mexico learned how to make it during those years. And now you have quantities of production that surpass anything that was remotely possible sending pounds through the mail. So now it covers the entire country. So the overdose death records that we're setting every month, it seems like now, are due to the fact that you have that drug being produced in Mexico, particularly on the western side of Mexico, western and northwestern side of Mexico, and in a country with which we share a 2,000-mile border and a free trade agreement.
Right.
So all of that stuff is coming up. We would never have achieved full coverage of the country. So from Maine to Skid Row, LA, and San Francisco and Seattle, you have this massive coverage now of fentanyl in virtually every part of the country now. And that's also what's driving this, because there's just so much more opportunity for people to add it to the dope they're selling, and therefore for people to die from it.
So is now 100% of the fentanyl coming in from these Mexican drug labs, or is some of it still coming from China?
I would say, I'm reluctant to say 100%, but certainly a vast majority of it now. Yeah, it's coming up from Mexico, dirt cheap and relentless. So again, it becomes a little bit like salt. You can put it in anything. Now you can, there are some stories of marijuana being doused with it. I'm not sure how often that happens, honestly, but it's the idea. And now, what you have is people all across the country who are no longer under any illusions of what they're using. They're using fentanyl. They know it. The guy in Maine, he knew it was called heroin, what he was buying, but he knew he was using fentanyl. You find this all over. People are now, if they haven't died from the initial contact or a few contacts, they develop very quickly an addiction, and that addiction takes them to whole new levels. The result of that too is they can die at any moment. They get a bad mix and they're dead. But the other result is it makes it extraordinarily difficult for them to succeed in treatment. It's a brutal withdrawal from fentanyl, I've been told. And so that is also part of the mix as well.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. I have to say, the scariest part about this is that those stories of it being mixed in other things and people unwittingly buying it and unwittingly taking it, who have no tolerance for it and could succumb, could die quickly because of that.
That's what began to happen exactly during the COVID years. If you think about it, one of the great tragedies of COVID was that it came along just as the trafficking world was achieving this unprecedented event, which was to cover virtually the entire United States with not one, but two synthetic drugs, meth and fentanyl, possible only because they have access to world chemical markets through these ports and have a vast production capacity now, all kinds of people getting into making it down there in Mexico. They solved, one of the interesting things about this is that they solved the drug dealers' most pesky problem has always been, where do I get my dope to sell? Because the drug war, for all its faults, had a wonderful tendency to always keep drug dealers off balance. They were always arresting their connections and, all that kind of stuff. And so you were constantly having to look for the stuff. Well, now you don't have to. That question has been answered. The question, where I find my dope to sell, it's everywhere. Now the question is, particularly during COVID, the question is, where do I sell all that I can get my hands on? Mm-hmm. Where do I sell all that I can get my hands on during a time when everyone's shut in their house and the only connection to the world that they have is through their smartphones and social media apps?
So what's the answer? Social
media apps. Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, you're finding huge amounts of these pills for sale, anonymous dealers selling, and frequently, of course, the buyers are young people who really are they're naive when it comes to the drug world. They don't know what they're buying. They don't really have a clue that the thing that they're hoping will cure their depression from being shut down for a year or two, is actually filled with fentanyl. They don't know what they're doing. And so what you began to see is part of the death toll was kids using their smartphone apps, seeing these kind of colorful menus. The menus are quite colorful, look like a kind of an ice cream menu, like all these different colors and stuff, and Percocets and Xanax, Adderall, all that stuff, and because frequently, I'm not sure if every place did this, but I know in Los Angeles, it was clearly the case where the dealers, because they knew their customers couldn't leave home, they were delivering. They offered home delivery. And frequently the dealers themselves were very young. It wasn't like they were older guys. It was like there were 19-year-olds selling to 16-year-olds and that kind of thing. Social media apps became the new street corner, particularly Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok. I went to a protest in front of Snapchat headquarters in Santa Monica. It was filled with people with posters saying Snapchat is complicit in the murder of my son or my daughter. All the death dates, were always 2020 and early 21. It was just the COVID year.
Right. When everybody was isolated and lonely and anxious and depressed and looking, we know that everybody's drinking more, they're doing drugs more, overdose rates are skyrocketing.
That was an effect of the vast supply. So now any schmo 19-year-old could get enough so that he could start his drug dealing business on Snapchat, Instagram, whatever, and make a decent living doing it. And perhaps also kind of, I talked with one DEA agent in Fresno they were seeing massive amounts of this in Fresno, he told me. And his feeling was that a lot of times the guys who were doing it were looking to develop a larger drug businesses. And this was their way of developing capital, was just they were selling it to kids. And of course, the kids were ignorant of what was in the drug and had no tolerance to deal with the fentanyl that was being included in these counterfeit pills.
So why are the social media giants not cracking down on this? Why isn't the U.S. government, the DEA, forcing them to do that?
Well, you'd have to ask the social media guys that. I think they don't want to get into set the precedent of editing. They want to be a platform. They don't want to be editing.
Right, but they've already been forced to edit. They were forced to take down people who were trafficking in young girls,
Right.
sexually. I mean, there is precedent.
And I think at Snapchat, I haven't talked to them really, so I think you need to talk with them about this. My understanding from talking to certain parents is that Snapchat has been making certain efforts in that regard. Is it enough? You'd have to talk to parents who are more deeply involved in that particular issue to know.
Why haven't we seen congressional hearings on this? We saw, congressional hearings about the terrible effects of Instagram, for example, on young girls' self-image and leading to eating disorders. It would seem that kids dying of drug overdoses would be even more important, or at least as important.
Well, can I say something about that? It's going to sound horribly immodest, but I do believe it to be true. Until The Least of Us came out, I don't remember anybody paying any attention to this topic. Okay. And that was in November. So it's been 4 months that's going on. And so I'm just thinking we've been consumed with COVID, all our focus on COVID. And now, of course, the Ukraine suddenly and all this stuff. And the story that I've been working on for 4 years comes as a total revelation to people. We didn't know anything about that. That's because for the last couple of years, as this stuff has really spread all across the country, our focus has been on COVID. And so I think part of it is because the story was never told.
Well, hopefully people are going to read the story now and hear the story on this podcast, because this follows your pattern here. Nobody was talking about the opioid epidemic until your book came out. Shame and stigma surrounded the disease of addiction. Nobody wanted to admit that their loved one had died of an opioid overdose. Nobody was talking about Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers. Your book was the first to start talking about it. They're followed by many other fantastic, amazing books also delving into that. And now, when you wrote Dreamland, the Sacklers were still naming museum wings and donating and the creme de la creme of society. They're now outcasts, with museums stripping their name from all the wings. And they're in the midst of negotiating some sort of a settlement, trying desperately to hang on to their money, by the way, and avoid any future criminal prosecutions or lawsuits. Perhaps The Least of Us will do the same thing, leading to, I would hope, congressional hearings on this.
I would say that I hope so. And then, of course, the whole methamphetamine story, too, has never been told. And that is also a harrowing tale we can get into in a minute, if you like. But we were so consumed by COVID that this happened very quickly. The case, what's happening now was really not really the case in 2018. 2017, 2018. It's just happened so fast. And so why are there no hearings on it? Because I don't think anyone's told the story. And because we've been preoccupied with COVID, as we should have been. It's a worldwide pandemic, we're going to say. But I'm not suggesting that it was irresponsible to do that. It's just saying that that's where we were. That was the state of affairs in the country. And I'm certainly hoping when it comes to these, how these pills are sold, and then also the methamphetamine story, that this book kind of does a little bit of that, pushes people to understand here's what's going on now. And it's a whole different story than what was going on 6 years ago.
You brought up methamphetamine. That is the other drug that is made in a laboratory that is now sweeping across the country. This is a different form of methamphetamine, though. Originally, I remember when, all of a sudden Sudafed went under lockdown in the local Walgreens. because people were stealing it to make methamphetamine. They've now come up with a new way to make it using other toxic chemicals. For short, you call it P2P meth.
Right.
Why is this new P2P meth even more of a scourge?
Well, I would say it's a good question. I would say to that exact answer, I have to be clear and say I don't know why. What I can tell you is that it is. So ephedrine is the drug you're talking about. It's decongestant and all these Sudafed pills. And the ephedrine meth they mastered down in Mexico through the 90s into the 2000s. They made lots of it. They knew how to make it. It was a big body of knowledge about how to make methamphetamine in the Western Mexican states. It was a drug that was very popular as a party drug. Then in 2008, the Mexican government put a regulation on ephedrine importations into Mexico. Only a few companies could possess it. And the trafficking world then had to switch to this new method. Actually, it's an old method, but it's new to them of making methamphetamine. It's very inefficient way, a lot of chemicals, it smells bad. It's not really a good way to make. You'd prefer to make it with ephedrine. But they switched. And this new method using this precursor known as P2P, short for phenyl 2-propanone, which is a common industrial thing. I just call it P2P. The only benefit it really had, and it was a crucial one for the stories we're talking about right now, is that you could make P2P many, many different ways. Unlike ephedrine, you can make it many different ways with all kinds of groupings of chemicals. And all these chemicals turned out to be industrial, very widely available, very common in industrial processes, very toxic, easy to come by. So what this means is they begin to realize, and it begins to explode, almost like a meth rush down in Mexico, beginning in about 2012, 13, 14. More and more people begin to get into making it. They learn how. It's a little bit more difficult. They learn from other chemists and so on. But the key thing is they get all the chemicals they need from the world chemical market. Some of them are made in Mexico. And you begin to see just an explosion of meth production down in Mexico, beginning, as I said, about 2012, 13, right in there. It's a drug that begins to kind of march across the country now. Before, with ephedrine, they could never get more than enough to cover parts of the Western United States. The Mexican ephedrine meth never went east of the Mississippi River. And now what you see is this drug, the new way of making it allows for such enormous production that it marches across the West, covers the West, jumps the Mississippi, goes through the Midwest by 2017, 18, definitely all through Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, Tennessee, et cetera, and gets up into New England, which never had any meth to speak of in 2019. But at the same time, the amazing story part of this, I thought, initially as I was writing this, was at the same time, they cover it so completely that the price collapses. It's not just that they cover it. I'm in Nashville right now, and the Nashville narcotics agents tell me that 5 years ago, meth went for $19,000 a pound. Today, it goes for $3,000 a pound. That's like 1,800 miles from Mexico. You're still getting an 80% price drop. And this is the same all across the country. So not only they cover it, the price drops and it becomes very, very, very prevalent. But then I discovered another story that I thought was just stunning, blew me away. And that is that as this drug spread across the United States, it is most certainly accompanied by rapid onset symptoms of profound mental illness. Schizophrenics, heightened paranoia, delusions, hallucinations. You're thinking everybody's after you. Think cheetahs coming out of the walls. All kinds of very antisocial behavior now it promotes. Unlike the ephedrine meth, which is all about partying with other people, now you're just alone constantly. You're terrified of everybody. There's no more partying on this drug. This is a very psychosis-inducing thing. It very quickly creates mental illness, and from there, homelessness, because you can't live with anybody and nobody can live with you. And from there, I believe very strongly now that it is one of perhaps the main driving forces behind the tent encampments we're seeing all across the United States. It's a perfect place. A tent encampment is a perfect place if you are in deep psychosis, terrified of the world, but then addicted to. It's a strange thing because it's tormenting, but it won't let you go either. You have to use it. And what's more, this methamphetamine, according to many people I've talked to, makes it easier to be homeless. It may create your homelessness or not. But whatever the case, once you are homeless, it makes it easier to be. You kind of separate from your grim reality.
Because you're in your own little world, right?
Exactly right. And so that's what we've also seen as this meth has marched across the country. You're seeing this advance. And this is, people say, no, you're wrong. This is homelessness is about the high cost of housing. And that's true that's an important part of what goes on in the whole story of homelessness in many areas. But we're seeing homelessness now and tent encampments created in areas with Rust Belt towns and Appalachian towns and rural towns with no remotely rising cost of housing. This is accompanying the methamphetamine almost all across the country. Of course, there's other drugs involved too. There's fentanyl, there's cocaine, there's alcohol, and marijuana, et cetera. But it seems that the meth is the real driving sinister force behind it. And the other thing that it does is a very scary thing too, is it makes you unwilling to leave this little world in which you have found friends through meth or found a community, so to speak. That put those in quotation marks, that word in quotation marks, because it's really not that. But you found this kind of connection through methamphetamine. So you find people freezing to death rather than leaving the tent encampments. I was just in southern Indiana about a month ago, and that's what an ER doctor told me. He says, we saw a tenfold increase in frostbite cases last very mild winter last year, tenfold increase in frostbite because no one would leave the tents. And a week ago, he told me a woman froze to death in a tent encampment. Even though her mother spoke with the mother said, "Hey, please, she went to the tent camp. Please come with me. Your 5-year-old son's at home. You have a warm home." The woman would not leave. And I hear this over and over and over. It's a scary thing that's accompanied by this methamphetamine, as I say, as it marches across the country.
You spoke to one homeless advocate who said she finds meth in every single homeless encampment, that it's everywhere.
Yes, right. And I think that's why I say, to me, I call them meth encampments. It's a slip of the tongue, but it's Freudian slip, I think. The tent encampments are outgrowths or symptoms, barometers, I guess, of our meth issue. That's what they exist for. That's why they exist. The meth is the main. We didn't, the housing prices in LA shot through the roof beginning in 2012 and then in San Francisco and all along. But they never shot through the roof in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Yet you have the same problems. And
it's accompanied by, the simple observation that a lot of times when you see homeless people, especially in New York City, and it's borne out by statistics, at least in this city, that they're not, homelessness is accompanied by mental illness. Right. And your argument is that a lot of that mental illness is being driven by methamphetamine use. And a lot of it depends on the area in which you live and how prevalent the meth is. But I think what's going on now is that the meth is so prevalent all across the country. It's kind of covered the country, as I said, that you're finding it. Boston was an area with high housing costs, but until this meth arrived, you never saw big tent encampments where people were just like an area known as the Mass and Cass area of Boston. You never saw that before. And again, you're seeing it in areas of southern Indiana, places that really do not have anything remotely close to a rising, overheated housing market like you're seeing in some towns. You say that users call it weirdo dope. Some do. In LA, that became among the gang members and among the folks that I talked to. A lot of them were because, I talked with this one guy who's an old gang member, and he's now a barber. He's years ago stopped being part of the gang, but he still hangs out in the neighborhood. He's still in the area, and he still sees the old homies and stuff. And he says it was amazing. Once they started with this new dope and the ephedrine dope, they stopped making the ephedrine dope. All of my old homies
you can't, he says, I remember him very vividly. He says, you can't even talk to them anymore. They're eating from the trash. They're wandering around screaming at something that these were guys I hung out with. They were part of the same gang. They have the same tattoos. And now they're out of their minds. They're not even able to control. They can't take care of themselves. Of course, they're on the street, sleeping wherever. It's a remarkable thing. Once you talk with people who are on the street, who are at the very ground level, you hear these stories. And what's amazing is that the stories are all pretty much the same. Albuquerque, Clarksburg, West Virginia, Southern Virginia, rural Indiana, Portland, Skid Row, LA. The stories don't change. Tent encampments look so much like almost standalone developments now.
Mm. How do you recover from a meth addiction? Is it harder?
See, with opioids, there are certain drugs that you can take that will alleviate the cravings. There's methadone. There's a branded thing called Suboxone, buprenorphine within it, Vivitrol. And they will help you help this craving subside, so you can control that. While the idea is you focus on recovering your life.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such thing as for meth. The only treatment for meth is separation from the dope. You cannot. There's no pill you can take. There's no treatment or anything. It's just simply separation from the dope, letting the brain heal, which apparently now takes quite some time on this meth, and just allowing your body and your mind to kind of return to normal. The problem is, in the words of some of the folks I talk to who deal with this daily, getting to that point can take months, and sometimes it's unclear whether it ever takes place.
Really?
And it's just you're talking about brain damage. The longer people use, the more chance they'll have of permanent, or at least semi-permanent brain damage, complete stripping of the memory. Part of the ability for this meth to get you used to homelessness is that you don't remember much. And this is very frequent, a stripping of the personality. That kind of thing. You're walking around in a daze, and if you're not in complete psychosis, running from all the monsters that are trying to kill you, you're kind of sitting there in a stuck, and your brain's just kind of like locked in on, and you can't really think much.
You interviewed a couple people who were meth users who said it took them like a year or two to learn how to speak again.
Yes, right. Speak. One guy, he couldn't really speak, but another guy said, I would try to speak, and by the time it came time to say what I had formulated in my mind, the conversation around me was like way past it. So I just never said anything. I remember another conversation with a woman who had been, by the time I talked to her, she was 2 years clean. She had been barking like a dog. She had been screaming. It was a terrible, terrible thing she got into. She gets into one of the few that I talked to that actually had made it into sobriety. And and her teeth were just almost melted. She had 2 years worth of dental work to return her teeth to what they had been. But she remembers, she said, it took me 6 months before I finally felt empathy. I was with my roommate in the sober living house, and she was watching a movie, Made in Manhattan, with Jennifer Lopez, and kind of a cornball rom-com kind of thing. And I watched it with her, this roommate, and middle of the movie, I just began crying. And it was almost tears of happiness, because I suddenly began to feel something for the characters in the movie. And it was a powerful story. I was like, wow. By the time I talked to her a year and a half after that moment, and she still knew. She knew that her brain had not returned to what it had been before pre-meth, P2P meth, I should say. She knew that, and I remember I can't remember the exact quote, I don't have it in front of me, but she said something like, I wish they would do research on what more we can do, because I've been using yoga and meditation, but I want to know what more I can do to heal my brain. And she knew that she had not returned to any kind of real normality, even 2 years after her last use.
Sam, why do people pick up this drug? I mean, what makes somebody say, hey, I want to try meth?
I spoke with a guy recently who had some light to shed on that. And he was a gay man who began using meth in the ephedrine days, 17 years ago or something like that. And again, he used it because it was a party drug. And he just, he had felt bullied and ostracized his entire life as a gay young man. And now he found this drug. It became kind of part of who he was. And he always felt great, elated, friendly with everybody. It just broke down all inhibitions. And he used it very much like that. And then he told me, then on a Friday in June of 2012, Friday night, the meth radically changed. It was never the same after that. I developed intense terror of everything around me. I was running out of the house, took my car, racing through the streets, get to a gas station, leave the car at the gas station and run off and get, and it's recovered at a tow lot 3 or 4 days later. And I asked him that, okay, so you now know that this meth is devastating mentally. And he says he kept on using it, looking for that elation, that euphoria that he knew from experience had been there, and he never really found it again. He kept using it. He says, and I said, well, why would you use again and again and again? He says, I used it many times. Each time it was a terrifying thing. I knew what it was like. I know what it now is like to know you're about to die, even though, of course, he wasn't never about to die. It was just his own psychosis creating that. And he says, that is the insanity of addiction. It made a lot of sense to me because, if you're willing to live in a tent in the winter, if you're willing to steal from the grandmother who read you books when you were a child, if you're willing to burn up all the love and trust of every family member you know, then you're willing to do almost anything. And so using this kind of dope makes kind of some twisted sense. It just shows you, Elizabeth, I think, the extent to which drugs of abuse, particularly nowadays in their prevalence and their potency, change, divert, and hijack the basic survival instincts that we evolved as species and all animals evolved to possess in our brains. It just completely does that, and it reverts it. It hijacks it and turns it. So sentient camels are exact representations of people who have lost all ability to commandeer their basic survival instincts. It's all about finding and using dope, no matter what the cost.
Your story about that one young man, he started using the ephedrine form of meth.
Yes.
Why would anybody start to use the P2P form of meth? I mean, don't you go right straight to paranoia and schizophrenia and hallucinations?
Because I think you are addicted to meth by then. And it's a strange thing. And I'm still interviewing people to find out their perspectives on this. But it's you are addicted to it and you can't let it go. Again, it's this insanity of meth. But in all cases, people that I've spoken with, people who were using it did not know anything about the meth that they were about to use. They didn't know that it was, in fact, it was a remarkable, they remember the date or the specific time.
That it changed.
Absolutely. I remember I was sitting at a pizza place with Eric Barrera, a guy I think you're referring to in the book, who was a former Marine, had used ephedrine meth, had basically a life more or less together for about 8 years. He had a job, a house, a car, a girlfriend, and so on. And then one night in 2009, he said it, the meth just changed and it never became different. I was out of my mind. I was believing that my girlfriend had hidden a man. This is a frequent hallucination, by the way. I've heard this numerous times now. My girlfriend has a man hidden in the walls or the mattress or under the rug or someplace. I've heard this so many times. It's a remarkable common kind of hallucination. He begins stabbing the mattress. He begins stabbing the walls. It goes out of his mind for a long time. And he said for the next 4 or 5 years until he got sober, he never ever felt that euphoria again. He was always looking for that euphoria. That's what drug addiction is. You're always looking for that first great high that you can't even believe is possible to experience, and it never happens. Well, he kept looking for it. Meanwhile, he's out of his mind. Meanwhile, all his friends disown him. His mom kicks him out. His dad doesn't want to see him. His girlfriend kicks him out. His life just spirals down into the point where he's just living out of his car and watching lots of porn and selling meth, because he doesn't have a job anymore. He doesn't have anything anymore.
Right. But does somebody using P2P meth for the first time get that euphoria?
I haven't heard of people getting that. No.
So it can't be creating new addicts. It must be all the old meth addicts who are
No, I
now
think
suffering.
I have to say, I think it is. I think it's a strange situation where you start using and then you can't stop using it.
Even though it's terrifying.
Yeah, yeah, it's a weird thing because frequently, and frequently, I think a lot of times the people who are using it for the first time are on the street already. Sometimes it creates homelessness again, and sometimes you're homeless for another reason, but it ends up being basically your, your crutch, the way you handle homelessness, and again, the way you feel part of something when you're all alone. I don't pretend to know all the answers to this. I think these are excellent questions. And sometimes I just don't, I have those same questions all the time and I'm still kind of groping for answers. But I do think that it's pretty clear that people are using meth for the first time and I'm just going off the rails and keep on using it because now they're addicted to it.
You also spend some time in this book talking about the neuroscience of addiction. You've touched on this already a little bit, but I was surprised and I thought this might be a bit of a controversial thing. You say and maintain that everyone has the capacity to be addicted to something. Everybody.
Sure, because we all, as human beings, all have the same brain chemistry, the same reward pathways that drugs of abuse or sugar or social media apps or nicotine, all these different.
So it might be something else, but
yes, it's a kind of an addiction to something maybe less potent than methamphetamine, maybe less potent than fentanyl, certainly. But nevertheless, it's the same reward pathways in our brains that were some of the more primitive parts of our brain to, first parts of our brain to evolve saying, I want, I need, I got to have that. I need this must have that. It develops well before our prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the part of our brain just behind the forehead, where you kind of govern, you govern actions and it's all about consequences and whether this is a good idea and that kind of thing. So every human being, in fact, every human being has this capability. It's who gets addicted and who doesn't frequently depends on life experience. Trauma is a big factor in all this. Also just supply, what you come in contact with, what your environment is like, how much support, how much familial support you have, that kind of thing is a big part of it as well. There's a lot of factors, but we all have the ability. That's why with the opioid epidemic, they would say, well, there's studies that show that, after, it doesn't matter what your genetic disposition is, after 100 days, I think it was, I have to see these studies again, but something like after 100 days, everybody has the disposition of constant use of 100 days, these pills, that everybody has the ability to be addicted to them. That's why the pharmaceutical companies pushed mightily for doctors to prescribe for 3 to 6 months, because eventually that person who may be able to take 2 or 6 Percocets without any problem for a thing that I had, an appendix operation, will have no problem leaving those pills after that and going. That's what did happen to me. I took 2 and I was done and I was fine. After 100 days of that, with refills, easy refills and that kind of discount cards to get them cheaper and all that kind of stuff, you will not have that ability to get over them so much. And then pretty soon your life, by then your life is sliding into complete unraveling. And
right.
and it's the longer prolonged exposure to that will do it. And that's because those opioids are so potent, have such a powerful effect on our reward pathways.
We see a lot of headlines now and a lot of discussion about the opioid crisis. President Biden just talked about it in a State of the Union address. Do you think that, and by the way, that wasn't the case when your first book, Dreamland, came out.
That's for sure.
Do you think that in a couple of years, we'll see more people talking about the meth crisis and the fentanyl crisis? I mean, as you say, meth doesn't get as much attention as opioids because it doesn't kill people. It just degrades them and decays them.
Yes. And it's the raw, think about it. Fentanyl kills people. There's a weird thing going on. With death, we're able to, express remorse, flowers, condolences, thoughts and prayers on Facebook and all that kind of stuff. Meth is more like the raw, unvarnished face of our worst addiction fears, and it's terrifying. And that's what I think keeps us from actually confronting it, because it is such an extreme example of people behaving in utterly dangerous ways, utterly out of mind, incapable of governing themselves. And that is kind of like the far extreme of addiction. We all have it in us. Everybody, we all know we have it in us. And because we all have that brain chemistry, we all have it in us. But it's all something we kind of think of like, oh my God. And we don't know what to do about it. I don't blame people for being overwhelmed by it. I don't know what to do about it either. It's a scary, scary thing to behold. But I do think, I just had a meeting with the staff of the mayor of Denver. Very interesting conversation with those folks. I've had conversations with folks at like the city levels, primarily city and county, where these issues are really hitting home badly. And so all of that makes me feel like, okay, now that COVID may be somehow receding in our consciousness, maybe it's now time where we pay attention to this stuff. And I think a lot of people at the city level, county level, have already been paying attention to this. Mm-hmm. It's just hard to galvanize the public around it, I'm hoping that that's what happens, because I was stunned. The first part of the book, as I was writing it, I thought the only part about meth I was going to write about was how much capacity for production they have and how they're able to cover this. And as I was in the middle of all this, I meet Eric Barrera, mm-hmm. and we have that conversation at the pizza place in Pasadena, in California. And after that was about a month before I was supposed to turn in a manuscript, and I put everything on hold. I said, wait, time out. And I began to call for the next 3 months. I began to call people all over the country. People who would know, people who were homeless outreach coordinators, ER docs, drug counselors, people who ran residential treatment clinics, on those kinds of folks who would see this daily. And I was struck. The more people I talked to, the more the story was the same. Just what Eric had told me, variations on that, riffing on that idea in their own ways, but it's the same story over. And I was stunned. Mm-hmm. Because I'd never heard anybody talk about this. No. And in fact, nobody has, except for in this book, I think. And it just overwhelmed me, because everything made sense then. The tent encampments made sense. The tent encampments in LA, okay. But what about the tent encampments in Clarksburg, West Virginia, or in rural Indiana, or places like this? What is the common denominator, And meth just seemed to, the massive quantities that they were producing down there had this effect, created this effect in all kinds of regions of the country, not just areas where the cost of housing was through the roof.
Sam Quinones, it's an amazing book, The Least of Us. You sounded the alarm once, right on the, precipice of the opioid epidemic. And you are sounding the alarm again about fentanyl and meth. And the importance of connection, which we know is what is key to recovery from anything and everything, whether it's drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, social media, at a time when we're hopefully emerging from the COVID pandemic and reconnecting once again. It's really, really important. So thank you so much. Congratulations on this groundbreaking book. And we really appreciate you being on Heart of the Matter.
Well, it's great of you to have me on, Elizabeth. I so appreciate it, and very, very grateful for your kind words. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening today to Heart of the Matter. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website at drugfree.org/podcast. And as a reminder, if you need help with a loved one who is struggling with substance use, you can text 55753 or visit drugfree.org. We'll talk to you soon.